Chapter 431, Testing the Water. Cough. That thing just passed. What was that? Was it a spiritual boat or a spiritual artifact? No idea. It looks like a spiritual boat running on the ground, but not quite. Who was that guy? Everyone was full of questions, and the topic changed to the supercar that they had just seen. This guy, who knows him? Xuanhuan asked curiously. I don't have the slightest idea. He looks to be quite familiar with the little princess of the Jiang family though. They talked among themselves animatedly. While they were talking, a large group of people raced over on all kinds of mounts. The spiritual artifact went that way. A white-robed young master rode over on a panting mount, and he was also feeling dizzy with the violent bumping. It's too bumpy. WTF? They told me that it would be steady. Before the car opened the top, it had reached a speed of more than 300 kilometers per hour. Of course, it was bumpy when they tried to chase after the car riding on demon beasts. Hurry, follow it. Slow down a bit. How can that thing be so fast? Hey, it is slowing down. Go. Stop. At least tell me where you bought this spiritual artifact. Dust rose again. Nonplussed in the wind, Xuanhuan gestured to several servants and said, go and find out the identity of that man. Xuanhuan looked thoughtful while Nangongzu looked unreadable while sitting on his scaly demonic unicorn. How can this thing be so awesome? As for the speed, the extremely powerful demon beast's speed wouldn't be slow. However, no demon beast could move so steadily at such a high speed. In fact, almost no demon beast-drawn carriages equipped with arrays could achieve this. With wind whistling past her ears, Jiang Ziyu had been a bit uneasy at first while her hair fluttered in the wind, but she soon relaxed completely and exclaimed at the sensation. The big white deer lay on the soft back seat, not daring to raise its head. Boss! Jiang Ziyu turned her head and exclaimed in surprise. There are so many people following us. Sit tight. Mr. Fang laughed. Buckle up your big white deer. How do I put the seatbelt on, little bell? Jiang Ziyu looked at her little hands, and she couldn't reach the deer. Move the seatbelt with your key. Snap. The big white deer got buckled up on the back seat. Swoosh. Mr. Fang stepped hard on the gas pedal. In the game, Mr. Fang dared to drive at a speed over 300 kilometers per hour as an ordinary man. With his current strength, he stepped on the gas and raced. Novel full. My goodness. He is speeding up again? How come it doesn't get tired? How can a spiritual artifact be tired? Can't catch up. I can't do it anymore. Soon, the car had few followers. Shortly, a blue shadow dashed to the door of Mr. Fang's shop. It almost parked before the door horizontally. How are my driving skills? Smug. Mr. Fang killed the engine and opened the door. Superb. Jiang Ziyu said excitedly. It's even better than in the game. A pathetic cry came from the back seat. Oh, my little bell. Jiang Ziyu immediately unbuckled it and saw the big white deer sway in the car with dizziness. It was just missing the circling stars before its eyes. Clang! It passed out. Obviously, its first experience in the car ride was very poor. Come out, guys. Help me move this creature inside. Mr. Fang yelled outside the shop. There was no garage in this world, but Mr. Fang could put the car in a stored spiritual artifact, which was very convenient. Under his employees' help, Mr. Fang carried the dumb deer to the lounge area and took the cup of milk tea Jiang Ziyu poured for him. This is your sister Lanruo. Mr. Fang introduced her to the beautiful girl beside him. She is helping out in the shop and will go to school with you. Hello, Sister Lanruo. This is Elder Li. Mr. Fang pointed at the solemn old man on the side. This is Zinner. Mr. Fang pointed at the shy girl and said, they are all new employees of this shop. Oh, while sipping the milk tea, Jiang Ziyu was a bit nonplussed. Boss, how come you captured an elder as your employee? After Mr. Fang introduced these people to each other, the new and old employees got along well. Of course, when Li Lanruo and the other two employees learned Ziyu's background, they were speechless. Boss, what did you say? Their minds turned blank. Meanwhile in the Zhuhai city, the customers created a group chat named the Legend of the Sword and Fairy Communication Group. The Legend of the Sword and Fairy 1 had been very popular, and the fan base grew after the Legend of the Sword and Fairy 3 was released. Jiang Ziyu, I'll manage the new group. I'll pull new players into the group. They are new employees in this shop. They are brand new. Husky's cute face. Lu Ningyan, new players again? Let me see. Su Tianji, my Legend of the Sword and Fairy is indeed super attractive. We have new members so soon. Lanruo joined the group chat. Li Waya joined the group chat. Little Zinner joined the group chat. Jiang Ziyu, welcome the new members. Su Tianji, New members, do you like Sister Long Kui, Red Kui or Blue Kui? TL note, in the game, a female lead, Long Kui, has two personalities. One has red hair and is aggressive, and the other has blue hair and is gentle. This question drew out many girls who were staying low in the group. Ningbai, Red Kui is good. Jiangziyu, I like Blue Kui. Sister Blue Kui is the best. Dong Qingli, don't you like Zujian? I think Zujian is so adorable. TL note, Zujian is another female lead. Song Qingfeng, are you all playing this game? I'm still playing Devil May Cry. They saw the messages in QQ group chat keep jumping up. Ugh boss, there are so many people in the other shops. Li Lanruo was still not used to this. They are so enthusiastic. Tentatively, she sent a message, hell, everyone. I like Zhu Changqing. TL note, Zhu Changqing is the second male lead in this game. Zichi spiritual master, that young man is good. He's knowledgeable and has good manners and high cultivation strength. Novel full. Zhu Zixin, FCK. Zhu Changqing is so handsome. Lin Xiao, I think Zhu Changqing is handsome too. Ugh nonplussed, Li Lanruo looked at Mr. Fang. Shouldn't we discuss sword techniques and spiritual spells here? How come the discussion turned to another direction? Meanwhile, in the Taiwan Inn, it's almost time. The exam of the Heavenly Academy is about to begin, right? The dim candlelight shone on Nangongzuo's big figure. His mild face looked a bit grim and desolate. Yes, a man answered. He was wearing a black silk robe with patterns of cloud dragons and swords. The person from the Li family will attend it too? Yes, he snickered. Although it isn't convenient to make a move inside Yuanyang City, the rules of this year's academy exam have changed. I'll see how you can slip from my grasp this time. At this moment, the man whispered something to him. You mean? Nangongzuo frowned. The man who picked up the princess of the Jiang family is the same one who appeared by the Li family when Nangongjuan got killed? His face turned strange, and his expression became thoughtful. Jiang family. He looked unreadable. Before the sword slaves make their moves, they jumped out to protect him? Or is he a member of the Jiang family? Or it's just a coincidence? Go and find out his relationship with the Jiang family. He stroked his chin while cold glints appeared in his eyes. Shall I test this guy? Chapter 432, Metal Machines and Spiritual Artifacts. Although the story of The Legend of the Sword and Fairy 3 had little to do with the previous game of The Legend of the Sword and Fairy 1, it was still popular among customers of the two shops. The spiritual spells and ultimate techniques of the two main characters, Jingtian and Zhu Changqing, were different from those of Li Xiao. For example, Zhu Changqing mainly cultivated rune spells instead of sword Dao, and Jingtian's main focus was the sword techniques based on the demonic sword for battle instead of the sword control technique. In fact, Jingtian only cultivated Shu Mountain faction's technique taught by Zhu Changqing. Jingtian's greatest strength was his astonishing understanding of Sword Dao due to his identity as the reincarnation of an immortal. The players could feel the strength of his in the game. When he played the game during the tribulation at Pengalai, Jingtian's strength was still average. Despite Mr. Fang's own high-level swordsmanship, he felt a clumsiness while using the sword techniques. However, as the story went on, he soon obtained a lot of inspirations in swordsmanship from Jingtian's own understanding. Different from The Legend of the Sword and Fairy 1, The Legend of the Sword and Fairy 3 had two main characters and two storylines, which enabled the players to play the game and view the world from two perspectives. They could obtain two different kinds of feelings while playing the game. The Legend of the Sword and Fairy 3 focused on reincarnation. The story of the reincarnations of Zhu Changqing and Xuanhuan was full of tangled love from 3 lifetimes. Only when the players went into this world could they understand the deep feelings which had sustained through their reincarnations. Meanwhile, Jingtian's storyline was divided into 2 parts. One featured the Miss of the Tang family, who was both willful and cute, and the other featured Long Kui, Jingtian's sister in his previous life 1,000 years ago who had been asleep in the demonic sword for 1,000 years. People felt the weight of this kind of love which had lasted more than 1,000 years. It was enthralling for most of the players in the 2 old shops and more so for the new players such as Li Lanruo. Since there were no customers visiting the shop, they forgot that they were employees while they played the game avidly. The Legend of the Sword and Fairy communication group was always boisterous with messages. Li Lanruo gradually joined the discussion and the topics varied from their favorite girl to who was the most handsome male in The Legend of the Sword and Fairy. QQ messages kept beeping all the time. Apart from these topics, They also talked about the story of Jade Dynasty and the sword techniques and spiritual spells in the Legend of the Sword and Fairy 3. At the lounge area near the entrance, Xiaoyu sat on a couch with a big white deer. The white deer held a cup of milk tea between its front hooves, enjoying the beverage. Yahaya, milk tea is so good. It yelled the words out inarticulately like a child. It is, isn't it? Jiang Xiaoyu said smugly, I used to eat the delicacies in the shop every day. Yeah. It let out a series of deer laughter. At this moment, a handsome young master who was about 20 years old walked toward the shop followed by an aggressive-looking servant. This young man was wearing a black robe. Young master, the clerk from the cloud bathing shop, the shop next to Fang Qi's, tried to stop them. You can't enter this shop. The shop owner offended Nangong. Ach! He screamed. Get out! The servant knocked him over with a kick and gestured to the young master before him, saying, Do you know who he is? I don't care about if it's Nangong or Beigong. There's not a shop in the city that my young master doesn't dare to enter. Ignoring the upheaval behind him, the young master waved his folding fan and glanced around at the layout of the shop. We got the right shop. The layout of the shop comes from the same person who designed that ground spiritual artifact. The servant bowed to him and said, Young master, the clerk said that the owner of this shop offended people from the Nangong family. It's no big deal. It's not us who offended them. The young master said indifferently, the people of the Nangong family are more arrogant than I am and are an eyesore for everyone. The shop owner is quite a figure. Let's go in and have a look. Yes. Upon entering, the servant yelled, Sir. He swallowed back his words as he was startled. While pointing at the girl and the deer sitting in the lounge area, he stammered, This, ugh? The young master froze as well. Isn't she the little princess of the Jiang family? He walked over immediately. I'm surprised to see the little princess of the Jiang family in this place. What an honor. Xiaoyu, is he your friend? Mr. Fang looked at the black-robed young man in bafflement. I'm Tang Yu. The young master cupped his hands and said, My Tang family excels in making spiritual artifacts and machines. We saw someone traveling in the city in a ground spiritual boat at a speed greater than ordinary demon beasts, so we come here to pay a visit. Mr. Fang's face twitched. Do you excel in machines or spiritual artifacts? The young master looked at Fang Qi as if he were a strange character. Brother, don't you know that my Tang family always combines machine mechanisms and spiritual artifacts? You can't separate them apart. A few days ago, I saw your ground spiritual artifact run so fast without any spiritual essence fluctuation. I'm surprised that I can find someone in the same circle in the city. Mr. Fang was at a loss for words. I know I'm presumptuous, but the young master asked, Can you let me have a look of your ground spiritual artifact? Mr. Fang thought for a moment and said, Okay, but you can only observe it for a moment, and you can touch it. Then, he took out the supercar from a stored spiritual artifact. Looking at the weirdly shaped but perfect ground spiritual artifact, Tang Yuan clicked his tongue and exclaimed in appreciation, Perfect. Indeed perfect. Everything connects with each other so well. This shape is designed to perfectly avoid the disturbance of winds when it runs. No spiritual essence. Not a trace of spiritual essence. It's completely made with machine mechanisms. He looked as if he wanted to stick his head inside the car. Mr. Fang's face twitched when he looked at this guy who obviously wished to drive away in his precious race car. He hadn't imagined that the incident where he raced in his car would draw the attention of a maniac fan of race cars and mechanisms. Meanwhile, the participants in the Taiwangan had received a message, the Heavenly Academy's exam will begin soon. The participants must arrive at the Heavenly Academy within 3 days. Chapter 433, Danger. This sword control technique is indeed good. Tang Yu was intently studying the race car when Li Lanruo and the other 2 shop clerks walked out. Boss, do you have a place to practice the techniques? The 3 study the spiritual spells and sword techniques in the Legend of the Sword and Fairy 3 each day and were eager to try them in real life. After glancing around, they couldn't find a place where they could test what they had learned. They couldn't do it outside the shop since the city prohibited flying, and even spiritual artifacts couldn't fly. If some shops needed to test their spiritual artifacts, they must apply for approval to remove the array covering a certain area. Of course, there was no guarantee that the approval would be granted. Mr. Fang scratched his head. For the customers from the other shops, they just tested the techniques in the space in front of the shops and had never encountered such a situation. Ugh! The sword can fly inside the shop. Li Wei formed a sword spell with his hand and controlled a flying sword to slowly rise and hover in the air. By his side, Li Lanruo yelled in surprise, "Guild President, I know the sword control technique now." Then, Mr. Fang saw a figure dashing past him. The person crashed into the glass door. The door remained intact, but the person Tang Yu was studying the car outside the door when he heard a loud noise and saw a figure getting stuck onto the door. This person couldn't get down. Mr. Fang Ziyu, who was sipping milk tea, and the big white deer who was holding a cup of milk tea looked nonplussed. Tang Yu looked at the figure without a word and then turned back to the car as if nothing had happened. "In the future, you must find another place to practice." With a dark expression, Mr. Fang pulled down the figure. "Don't make the shop messy and disorderly." However, curious, Fang Qi stared at Li Lanruo, who was still reeling from the crash. "Did you fly with the sword control technique?" Although she couldn't obtain complete control of her flight, she had indeed flown up with the sword control technique, which meant that she was almost proficient with it. She learned it so fast. After all, many people in Zhuhai City and Half City had spent a long time in practicing the control of the sword, let alone flying on the sword. If he put all the credit on the potential fact that the cultivators of spirit state were more talented. Fang Qi glanced at Elder Li Wei and saw that the old man was still practicing how to control the sword. It would take a long time for him to fly on a sword. Mr. Fang beckoned at her. "Get in the car." "Are you going out in this spiritual artifact?" Tang Yu immediately walked over. "Brother, can you take me with you?" Mr. Fang's face twitched. "Is this guy a close friend of mine?" Seeing Mr. Fang's displeasure, the young master added in a hurry, "I heard that you have some trouble with the Nangong family due to this shop." "Don't worry, I'll protect you." "Okay, that's settled then." Then, he got into the car. Mr. Fang. He wanted to say that he had antagonized Nangong family not only because of the shop. He had also killed more than 100 members of that family. "Guild President, where are we going?" Sitting in the passenger seat, Li Lanruo watched the fast-passing views outside the window. "We're going out of the city." Since she had just begun learning the sword control technique, it was impossible for her to resist the force of the array inside the city. She could only use this technique at full force outside the city. Outside the south gate of Yuanyang City was a huge square named Cloud Sea. There were no roads leading down the mountain. This city didn't even consider receiving any cultivators or warriors who couldn't fly up. There was a parking lot for large spiritual boats near the gate, and cultivators and small spiritual boats could land on this square. Since the square was outside the city, there was no array to restrict flying. Fang Qi stopped his car on the edge of the square, and the deep abyss was right beside it. The river running out of the city poured down like an upside-down Milky Way. Many spiritual boats and flying cultivators landed from the sky, and it was a grand sight. Fang Qi got out of the car and said, "How about you try flying here?" In the next instant, she screamed while an invisible force pushed her off the edge of the square. Li Lanruo screamed, "Ah!" Soon, a woman wearing a blue dress shot up into the sky while stepping on a sword. "My goodness, look at that sword light." "What's that? It's so fast." The passing cultivators were dazed by the sight. Tang Yu was also astonished and yelled with widened eyes, "How does she fly like this?" "She is as fast as the Wind King wings of my Tang family." The vast sky was a fitting practice field for people who had just begun learning the sword control technique, since they wouldn't crash into anything even if they didn't know how to make turns. With a scream resonating in the sky, the sword energy drew a huge arc in the sky and dashed around with an irregular route like a headless fly. But gradually, the person on the sword began to obtain some control of the flight route. Soon, a bright blue sword energy shot through the heavenly mist and spiritual light and slowed down before landing on the square. A woman wearing a blue dress stood on the sword with her hair and clothes flapping in the wind. With bright sword light reflecting in her eyes, she looked like a female sword immortal descending from the heavens. The people around her were stupefied. Mr. Fang applauded. "Great, awesome, you are a quick learner." She had to learn fast. She almost died of fear. However, she had to say, "Thank you, Guild President. I seem to have mastered the sword control technique." After all, the senior had done it for my own good. She had to thank Fang Qi while she had the urge to hit him. It was a weird feeling. "However, you learned it really fast." While stroking his chin, Mr. Fang looked her up and down curiously and said, "Good. I think you'll do fine in that academy exam. You can at least flee when someone tries to hunt you down." "Flee?" Tang Yu said loudly. "She can outrun most of the cultivators." "Can she?" Mr. Fang said in bafflement. I feel like the sword ball of Nangong is quite fast. She still needs to work on her speed while flying on a sword. Tang Yu said in surprise. Didn't you just buy a shop? Why did they use the sword ball on you? He suddenly froze and said, a couple of days ago, I heard that Nangong family lost over 100 people when they tried to hunt down a small family. Are you their targets? Glitz flashed in his eyes. Do you plan to attend the Heavenly Academy's exam? Mr. Fang said. She will attend it. Is there a problem? Few forces in the world dare to challenge Nangong family in public. Tang Yu no longer looked flippant. He said earnestly, you guys are indeed amazing. He continued, however, the Nangong family has many trump cards, and they won't let you get away from it after you killed so many people. You must be very careful if this lady intends to attend the exam alone. He shook his head and said, I don't know what trump cards you have, but this exam will be extremely dangerous. Chapter 434, Jiangzia's entrance exam. It's the swords instead of the people of the heaven-seeking sword palace that you must be wary of. The swords controlled by people are not horrifying. However, if you encounter the people controlled by swords, you must be very careful. The young master said in rare seriousness after he understood the relationship between these two people in the Nangong family. With narrowed eyes, Fang Qi dug out a cigarette box from his pocket. Looking at the last cigarette, he suppressed his urge to light it and put the lighter back into his pocket. He frowned at Tang Yu's warning. He savored the hidden meaning in Tang Yu's words and began to understand the great depths and accumulation of the major forces in the spirit state. Then, he put away the cigarette and shrugged. Why do people always like making trouble? Novel for the Heavenly Academy. In the rolling spiritual mountains, there seemed to be spiritual lights flashing and purple spiritual essence rising. The Heavenly Academy was situated in the depths of the misty spiritual essence. In fact, this year's Academy exam went beyond its original purpose. Due to its unusual importance, all the existing disciples of the Heavenly Academy would participate in the exam as well. People still could enter the Academy through this exam, but it would be extremely difficult to get the first place and become the old Academy Master's last disciple, thus learning the ultimate heavenly insight scroll. Of course, for some people, this wasn't their concern since their goal was not the first place. Nangongzuo's eyes looked cold. It's said that that woman of the Li family has obtained more cultivation strength with the assistance of Mystic Fate Jade? Yes, young master. The man wearing a black silk robe answered. Besides, it's said that she has learned the wonder sword technique, and she can fly extremely fast while standing on a sword. The cultivators saw it on the Cloud Sea Square. Fast? Nangongzuo snickered. How fast can she be? Can she fly faster than my sword? What about that kid with her? Nangongzuo asked. Have you found out about his relationship with the Jiang family and his background? His background is not clear, the man said. I only know that he is close to the little princess of the Jiang family. He has a shop in the city, but we can't find out about his background. He's being secretive and trying to act? Nangongzuo said. You can go now. Yes. After that man left, two ghost-like figures appeared from thin air behind Nangongzuo. The two black-cloaked figures kneeled on the ground. After he leaves the city, the two figures shot out like two pitch-black sword beams. Nangongzuo had cold glints in his eyes. We'll soon find out who you are. Meanwhile, Xuanhuan, who had been cultivating in his room, suddenly opened his eyes and saw that the sky outside the window had turned extremely gloomy. Crack! A bolt of lightning shot down from the sky with blinding light in the dim sky, and the thunder rumbled. Who has forced the Nangong family to use sword slaves? Fragrant flowers in front of the window bloomed, and several yellow birds frolicked around the eaves. A white-robed young master stood in the corridor in the courtyard and looked at the gloomy sky with an ancient scroll in his hand. The characters on the scroll looked ancient and complicated as if they were written in a language from a distant past. A tiny petal of a flower or a leaf can change one's whole life, or it would be meaningless. In the sky, with many engravings of strange array patterns, a pair of huge wings made with gold and jade spread out, and a black-robed young master faintly smiled. I'll set off before you guys. A flash of light shot across the sky. Then, many spiritual lights shot up from Yuanyang City like fireflies in the gloomy sky. They used their respective powerful techniques and shot toward the northeast direction in the form of light beams. Novel full boss. We're setting off now. On Cloud Sea Square, Jiangziyu waved her little hand. Let's go to the school, Sister Lun ruled. Then, They drew a long trail of sword beam and joined the magnificent river of spiritual lights. Don't be smug. Our senior sister will be the champion of this year's academy exam. A voice mumbled in the crowd. Stop your nonsense. In the crowd, a woman wearing a pure white Taoist robe with a pair of cranes embroidered on the hem lightly pushed back her bamboo hat and glanced over. Then, she flew up elegantly riding on the wind. While looking unworldly and ethereal, she followed the crowd in a distance. It was the first time that all the masters of the younger generation gathered so close together. Stepping on her flying sword, Jiang Ziyu flew to the foremost of the group smugly. Sister Lan Ruo, don't worry. The items in the boss's shop are extremely awesome. How many scrolls of the heavenly book have you read? Ugh, only 3 scrolls, and I haven't fully understood them yet. Don't worry. Jiang Ziyu patted her small chest and promised, just watch me. When she stayed in the shop, she was only an employee with a super powerful senior and a mighty boss above her, and she had never had an opportunity to show her abilities. Now, she couldn't suppress the strong urge to show her hand. She was extremely pleased. After all, her boss couldn't come to the exam. The most he could do was watch from outside. It was her opportunity to show her abilities. She almost jumped with excitement. Hey, hear me out. When we're in the exam, just stay with me. I promise that I'll bring us to victory. I've read all the scrolls of the heavenly book and mastered the sword control technique for many years. I can also use all the ultimate techniques including magic shield spell and ice roar spell. Li Lanruo's eyes widened. Her brain went blank. She had just encountered the super powerful senior Fang and wanted to show her hand. However, seeing the super powerful princess who had just appeared, she knew that she had a long way before her. The rolling mountains outside the Heavenly Academy were full of all kinds of demonic birds and beasts. In addition, the origins of these spiritual mountains could trace back to the distant ancient times. Although it wasn't a forbidden zone where no one could pass, these mountains were a dangerous area for ordinary people to move through. Meanwhile, these mountains were full of all kinds of spiritual flowers and herbs and even rare treasures. Novelful at the same time, they were covered by all kinds of restriction arrays from ancient times. For this exam, the Academy had put some other restriction arrays in the mountains. The rule for this year's Academy exam was passing this huge area of spiritual mountains and reaching the mountain gate of the Heavenly Academy. Of course, this was the basic requirement for passing the exam. The Academy only had 81 spots, which meant that not all the cultivators reaching the gate would be accepted. They must find as many natural treasures in the mountains as possible, and the people who got the most treasures would rank higher on the list. Treasure hunting had been a necessary experience and a common training method for all the cultivators and warriors. Whenever a mystical relic came out, it would draw large groups of cultivators to explore. This academy used this method to test the participants. Of course, the dangers didn't only come from the spiritual mountains. They may also come from the other participants in the exam. Chapter 435, Playing with the Communication Jade. First, on the Heavenly Academy's huge sky-patrolling spiritual ship stood all the young cultivators and warriors from all over the place who were here to participate in the Academy exam. Yes, there were some warriors among them. In the long history of the continent, a few ultimate warrior masters had appeared, and their names were engraved in the history books. Once, an ultimate genius turned from a cultivator to a warrior and finally became the Lord of Emperor Warriors. He had come from Heavenly Academy. Besides Jiang Ziyu, there were other demons who looked unlike normal humans. They traveled here from distant places to seek Tao. All kinds of people could be seen here. This was the Heavenly Academy. A middle-aged man wearing a black robe stood on the deck in front of the crowd. His gray hair was coiled into a bun at the top of his head, pinned by a wooden pin, and he looked like a disheveled Taoist. The other was a silver-haired middle-aged woman wearing a white robe. She looked to be about 40 years old. I think you all understand the rules of this academy exam. The middle-aged man said, if you have no objections, you can now fly off the spiritual ship and enter the spiritual mountains. You must reach the academy gate by the end of the 7th day. You will be disqualified if you can't reach the gate by that time, even if you obtain many treasures. How difficult can it be? A voice sounded, and the person jumped off the spiritual ship. Then, spiritual light shot out of the spiritual ship like flower petals scattered down the sky by a fairy. Let's land on Cloud Hacking Mountain over there. Here, it's said that the ethereal summit has lots of good stuff. Junior Master Zun, shall we go to the White Cloud Hill? In Mr. Fang's shop, a big white deer finished its milk tea and lounged on a couch, feeling aimless after losing the job as a mount. Suddenly, shadows appeared before the entrance. For the first time, the shop was graced by new players. Where's you? Xuanhuan strode into the shop followed by a group of people. Some looked tough and wore armor while others had furry ears. Xuanhuan looked around. Where's the shop owner? The big white deer who had been calmly lounging on a couch shivered in fear and dropped onto the ground. Your Highness? Princess, Her Highness has gone to take the academy exam. Please get up. Xuanhuan waved his hand casually. You don't have to be so formal in the shop. It's inconvenient. Ugh. Boss Li Wei walked up. Boss is out. What do you want to play? We have The Legend of the Sword and Fairy 3. It's super fun. Then, he immediately corrected himself. It's super helpful for cultivation. I understand. Xuanhuan thought for a moment, remembering that all the old players expressed themselves this way in the internet cafe. I'm an old driver. Get me milk tea and instant noodles. Xuanhuan yelled. Li Wei and Li Ziner froze. What is an old driver? Zhen Yan. Zhu Ming. Go and pour a few cups of milk tea. Seeing the puzzlement on the clerks' faces, Xuanhuan was a bit embarrassed, wondering if he had got the wrong words. Yes, he had only gotten to the part of Jade Dynasty where Bro died and was eager to watch the rest. He took a seat and put on the virtual reality headset before clicking open Jade Dynasty and beginning to watch intently. Sir Li Wujia's face twitched while he said, Don't you want to try our new game, The Legend of the Sword and Fairy 3? I want to try it. A big white deer walked over with a handful of crystals in its mouth. Are they enough? It yelled like a toddler who was just learning how to speak and shook the storage bag on its back. If not, I have more. It sounded as if it was still practicing the human language. It had drank milk tea, and now it even wanted to play the game. The two employees exchanged a look, wondering what kind of demons had come to visit the shop while the shop owner was out. As members of a small family, they were shocked by the strange developments. Yehaya, this is so fun. It's very helpful for my transformation into the human form. Since the princess didn't need her to be the mount today, the deer decided to take the opportunity to play the game. The two shop clerks felt like crying, wondering what was happening. Boss, please come back. Can we really let this thing play? However, Mr. Fang was quite busy now. Meanwhile, the cultivators in Zhuhai City and Half City widened their eyes when they saw the message in the group chat. FCK, where's this place? A photo was posted in the group, showing a dense forest with an abundance of spiritual essence. Obviously, someone had taken a selfie, and there was also a pretty girl wearing a blue long dress beside her. Look at the bottom on the right. They are 7-leaf flowers. Look at the left. That's 1,000-year-old moonlight grass. Dang, dang, dang. Smug. Jiang Ziyu pulled out QQ interface on her new communication jade. The new communication jade newly developed by the Wui Taoist Alliance couldn't contain things that were too complicated, but it contained QQ. After downloading QQ, they could transfer the QQ messages into data supported by spiritual essence on the communication jade. In this way, the users just needed to connect QQ on the communication jade to the internet cafe in Yuanyang City. Of course, it would take the cultivators many years to develop their own apps as in the real smartphones. She took a picture of herself with a victory hand and posted, Now, I'm on Cloud Hacking Mountain outside the Heavenly Academy. Soon, a picture of the cute Jiang Ziyu appeared in the Legend of the Sword and Fairy communication group. Sister Lanruo, let's take a selfie and send it to the group chat. Okay. Li Lanruo was dazed. You promised that you would bring me to victory, but now you are playing with the communication jade and taking selfies? If the old academy master knew about it, he might become so angry that he would forbid playing with communication jade during the exam. The big white deer was still playing games. Without any knowledge about games, it just played blindly. It played an online game instead of a single-player game. On the screen, a female wizard wearing cotton clothes stood there with a small wooden sword in her hand. Several warriors stood in front of her. A tough voice came from the Zhuo army channel. Guys, what are you doing in the newbie village? We're teaching a girl how to play the game. You know what? This girl is super cute. She speaks like a toddler and is cuter than my own little sister. What? There are girls in the game? A warrior hacked the monster before him and said in excitement, Yehaya, you guys are so awesome. A little wizard named Lu Xiaoxian looked pleased with a wooden sword in her hand. Chapter 436, Sneak Attack and also Steal Potato Chips. The Heavenly Academy couldn't sit back and watch if these participants fell into mortal danger, so it gave each of them a Heavenly Insight token, a spiritual artifact looking neither like gold nor jade. Once it was activated, it would release a spiritual stamp with great defensive power while sending a message to the cultivators of the Heavenly Academy on the sky patrolling spiritual ship. Although only a part of the mountainous area was set aside as the exam area, the space was still vast, and the ship couldn't monitor everything happening in the exam area. However, once this token was activated, the message would be sent to the spiritual ship. It meant that the participant forfeited the exam and would be rescued by cultivators of the Heavenly Academy. Of course, this token didn't guarantee safety. The participants might die before they could activate the tokens, or some powerful force might just break the defensive stamp of the token and kill them. Everything was possible. In Cloud Hacking Mountain outside Heavenly Academy, Jiang Ziyu began to broadcast her exam by posting texts and images on QQ with the communication jade. On the other hand, she had a bag of potato chips. Sister Lanruo, do you want more? Jiang Ziyu crunched on the potato chips and handed a bag bigger than her head to Li Lanruo while saying with a smirk, "Now, boss can't stop me from eating." While eating potato chips, Li Lanruo said with great enjoyment, "So delicious. How come we don't have potato chips in the shop? I got it from a gift box at the New Year party." She had complained about her bad luck when she saw others getting items like the Black Snow Treasure Sword or Rune number 13. But now facing Li Lanruo, who had never opened gift boxes, she was quite smug. "It's a new item that the shop has never sold yet." At this moment, some faint, irregular noises came from the hidden places near them. "Look!" A black-robed young cultivator pulled the leaves before his eyes and saw a lowly and a blue-clothed beauty who were busy eating potato chips, oblivious to the things around them. "They are alone?" Another black-clothed young man said as if he had discovered a new continent. "They show no signs they haven't discovered us for one bit." He beckoned at his companions. "Come over here. Come over here. That girl seems to be the little princess of the Jiang family?" A yellow-clothed young man froze as if he had recognized Jiang Ziyu. "We might greatly offend the Jiang family if we attack her." "What are you afraid of? We'll just take her items and won't hurt her." In the academy exam, if we don't dare to attack anyone we meet, it's better that we just pack and go home. I checked around and found nothing good around this place. I'm sure that this little girl took them all. You're right. There were about 10 people in the group. Let's attack at the same time. Many masters from major forces had entered this year's exam, but it didn't mean that the others had no chance. It was hard for cultivators with moderate strengths to survive in the spiritual mountains full of restriction arrays and look for natural treasures. For the smart participants, they either joined a master or formed a group with other participants. When they were in danger, they could deal with it with combined forces and thus reduce damage. This group of a dozen or so cultivators was clearly trying to use this strategy. Some of them came from one force and thus had a tighter bond. More than 10 people sneak attacking too. Obviously, they had greater odds of winning. "Brother Huang, you guys set a net array and restrict their spiritual essence," the black-clothed cultivator said in a low voice. "Do it at my signal, and I'll break her protective spiritual artifact with a black feather snake needle at the same time." "Okay, Brother Mo, you even brought black feather snake needles with you?" The yellow-clothed man licked his lips. "I wonder what elixir they're eating. They seem to be enjoying it very much. Let's take it and try it ourselves." "Right, we'll have a taste of it too." The black-clothed cultivator sneered. Then, he concealed his presence and moved forward stealthily. Next, an air-piercing whistle came. "Move!" With a yell, a large pale blue light net surrounded Jiang Ziyu and Li Lanruo. The light net spread to the depths of the mountain around them. Under this light net, Jiang Ziyu and Li Lanruo's spiritual essence stopped circulating. Meanwhile, several sharp black needles shot toward them with low whistling sounds. It seemed that Jiang Ziyu was too dazed to react. "Move!" The black-clothed cultivator looked pleased. "We got them." At his order, about 10 cultivators wearing yellow or black robes removed their concealment and stealth techniques and launched all kinds of spiritual spells and spiritual artifacts. At this moment, they suddenly saw Jiang Ziyu holding 2 metal spiritual artifacts with strange shapes. One was black, and the other was white. The black-clothed cultivator felt that she didn't activate any spiritual essence. "She is even weaker than I expected." The black-clothed cultivator sneered. The black holes in the spiritual artifacts suddenly shot out burning flames. Crack, crack. The dozen or so cultivators and several spiritual artifacts dropped to the ground like dumplings going into the pot. We have suppressed your spiritual essence. What is th? Jiang Ziyu changed the magazines and murmured to herself, these guns are not good without my spiritual essence. Their power is so weak. Pooh. The black-clothed cultivator spat out a mouthful of blood, and it wasn't clear if it was caused by the fury or getting shot. Li Lanruo was at a loss for words while standing beside her. Meanwhile in the distant Zhuhai city, Li Heron was explaining something to his audience with a few bullets engraved with pale blue spiritual patterns in hands. After many experiments, we produced the 8th type of bullets, spiritual penetration bullets. While holding one of the bullets, he said, they are derived from the basic magnum bullets, and the guns are based on the special guns originating from those in Devil May Cry 3 which can condense demonic energy. On the bullets, we engraved the special arrays used to break protective spiritual artifacts or spiritual spells. Have you tested them? We tested them only at the spiritual shooting range, Li Heron said. The shop owner brought Ziyu here last time, and she bought some bullets. I wonder if they are effective. Pooh. The black-clothed cultivator spat out another mouthful of blood and passed out. The cultivators who didn't pass out immediately lowered their heads. Ziyu sent a screenshot to the group chat. I'm awesome. I knocked down more than 10 cultivators in one breath. Awesome, awesome, powerful. Ziyu is the champion. Then, she looted them cheerfully and took everything that they had. Humph. Where were you when I got attacked and robbed every day in the Legend of Mir 2? Ah, my spiritual herbs. Seeing Jiang Ziyu taking all of their precious spiritual plants, they felt like crying, wondering what kind of spiritual artifacts could unleash such great power without spiritual essence. How could they survive that? They released their heavenly insight tokens. GG. Chapter 437, Sword Slaves. Cloud Hacking Mountain. Mr. Fang looked at the messages on QQ. Jiang Ziyu posted pictures in the group chat while she was collecting the rare plants on Cloud Hacking Mountain and putting them into her storage bag. Despite the large number of precious plants in the spiritual mountains, it wasn't safe to collect all of them since some places were guarded by restriction arrays. If the participants were not careful, they would be disqualified while they tried to collect the plants. Most of the spiritual treasures and plants in the mountains varied from level 3 to level 6, and there were a few rare level 7 spiritual plants. The level 7 treasures were guarded by powerful demon beasts or had their own self-protective mechanisms besides potential restriction arrays. It was extremely difficult to get them. All the level 6 spiritual items were guarded by restriction arrays, and some of them were also guarded by demon beasts. If one were lucky, they might find a level 6 item object guarded by a weak restriction array. Jiang Ziyu's eyes brightened when she saw a level 6 spiritual flower surrounded by some level 5 spiritual grass in the swamp before them. Obviously, she was quite lucky today. Then, she glanced around. Restriction arrays? Novel full. These restriction arrays aren't too obvious. Li Lanru clicked her tongue. These restriction arrays were concealed but not as advanced as those in other places. Were they really this lucky? When Jiang Ziyu walked closer to the swamp, several cold gazes flashed in the darkness. Someone's here. Good. They're going to take the bait. They saw a harmless loli in a white dress and a beauty wearing a long blue dress. Isn't she the woman of the Li family? A voice whispered. For some reason, the Nangong family is trying to hunt and capture her. I'm surprised that she's here. Young Master Nangong is around. If we catch her and hand her to the Nangong family. They were excited at this prospect since it was a rare opportunity to gain favors from and establish a relationship with the Nangong family. Be careful. The other seems to be a member of the Jiang family. She's just a little girl. No one can run from the poison of my 1000 Spider Valley. To help me with this exam, the elders have given me all the top-level poisonous creatures treasured in the valley. Then, we'll rely on you, Taoist brother Duzuzi. No problem. All good. While they spoke, Jiang Ziyu broke the restriction array and waved her small hand. Then, a small skeleton appeared before her. The small skeleton walked up with an axe. The small skeleton stopped before the spiritual flower and bent to pick it. Suddenly, a big colorful spider sensed danger, and it jumped up and bit the skeleton. The small skeleton continued to collect the flower as if nothing had happened. The people hidden in the darkness exchanged a look. Taoist brother Duzuzi, What poison did you use? It's a ghost spider. Its poison will travel all over the body through the meridians and blood veins. Do you think that thing has meridians? They fell silent. Where did the skeleton come from? The small skeleton collected the spiritual flower and all the spiritual plants in the area as if nothing had happened. Okay. Jiang Ziyu waved her small hand, and the skeleton collapsed on the ground. Here, the level 5 plants are for you. Then, they walked away boldly. No. The people hiding in the darkness were not pleased, and their faces darkened. That's our level 6 spiritual flower. Stop. 1 minute later, they all dropped to the ground with multiple gun wounds on their bodies. With their storage bags emptied out, they screamed while lying on the ground. Wait. That's our spiritual flower. Don't hit us anymore. In their pathetic howls, the useless items from their storage bags were tossed onto their faces. Feeling powerless, they released their heavenly insight tokens. Novel full. Meanwhile, on White Cloud Hill, a bright-eyed young man wearing a purple robe and a golden belt emitted purple aura which surged up and condensed into a furious purple dragon around him. Beside the purple dragon, there was a demon snake covered in gold iron scales that had a pair of wings. The ugly and vicious head of the demon snake was as big as a person, but now it lay on the ground and couldn't be deader. In Fufang Valley, a white-robed young man with long hair stood with a scroll in his hand. Before him lay a huge golden-furred tiger. It lay on the ground and didn't dare to move a muscle as if the harmless-looking young man was a prehistoric demon beast. The white-robed man ambled into the depths of the valley and stopped in front of a huge tree that reached the sky. On the tree was a golden fruit, and the fruit's presence showed that it had probably reached level 7. On the ethereal summit, an astonishing sword energy slashed down as if it descended from the sky. On the high cliff surrounded by white clouds, sword energies with sharp and crystal-clear essence knocked down more than half of the boulders on the mountain, startling many birds into flying away. A woman wearing a pure white Taoist robe and a bamboo hat wiped blood off her cheek, and the cultivators who had tried to besiege the mountain and attack her lay on the ground. From the looks of it, more than half of the cultivators on the ethereal summit were packed here. Senior sister, here are the spiritual items that they collected. A green-clothed girl spat and said, they are as blind as bats, daring to rob us when we found good items. Now, their stuff belongs to us. That's it. The woman nodded slightly and wiped blood from the tip of her sword with a white silk handkerchief. Fierce battles were happening everywhere all the time. However, in one place, things were very quiet. Young Master Nangong. A tall young man wearing a robe with clouds, dragons, and sword patterns on it stood with his hands clasped behind his back. Behind him stood almost 100 cultivators. We are willing to follow young Master Nangong. Nangong Zuo's eyes turned sharp. I saw that the woman of the Li family had gone in the direction of Cloud Hacking Mountain. Send someone to keep an eye on her. Yes. In the group chat at Mr. Fang. Where's the despicable boss? Jiang Ziyu stomped her foot. She was showing off her loot but couldn't find her despicable boss. In the sky above the Cloud Sea Square outside Yuanyang City, under the gloomy clouds, a figure stood on the blade of a sword. The people on the ground pointed at him. What's that? In the high sky, surrounded by lightning flashes, two black shadows hovered in the gloomy clouds like ghosts. The person standing on the sword was closer to the ground, and people could roughly see that he was a young man wearing a blue and white robe. In the sky, the two shadows suddenly moved closer at a horrifying high speed. Covered in black cloaks, their hands and feet were coiled by chains, and clouds of creepy pitch-black mist were emanating out from their cloaks, making them look neither like humans nor ghosts. One of the shadows pointed its finger. Fang Qi slightly frowned, finding the sword technique resembled the one used by Nangong Juan. He slightly moved to the side at a speed undetectable by the naked eye. Boom! With an earth-shaking noise, a spiritual boat behind him and the cliff behind the spiritual boat were hacked open like tofu. The same sword technique, but the power is unbelievably greater. How come it feels like this guy cultivated the evil-avoiding sword technique? Mr. Fang muttered. TL note: the evil-avoiding sword technique is a technique in a classic wuxia novel written by Jin Yong, and the practitioners have to be male and cut off their own genitals. Hurry! Retreat into the city. The cultivators outside the city scrambled to run. It suddenly, a cultivator yelled in shock, those are sword slaves of the Nangong family. Who is he? He dares to face the Nangong family sword slaves and not run? Run? Another cultivator said in a snicker, how can he run? Beep. You receive a new task. New task. Establishing dominance is required to keep a foothold. 1. Task description: Please defeat your enemies in the most shocking and dominating way. Task Reward, Fortune Prize Wheel. Chapter 438, Mr. Fang failed to establish dominance. Mr. Fang looked up at the two half-human and half-ghost figures who flashed by in cloaks. I can defeat them, but what is the most shocking and dominating way? While people of the Nangong family were still cultivators, the sword slaves were human-shaped weapons designed solely for battles. Each of their attacks emitted frightening murderous spirit and the nauseating smell of blood, reminding people of the many tombs that buried the poor souls that had died under their swords. The Nangong family of the heaven-seeking sword palace had gained its reputation mainly because of the sword slaves. The Nangong family had gotten even more overbearing in recent years, inducing disapproval from the other major families. However, the other families hadn't shown their displeasure yet since they knew the Nangong family had gotten a lot of benefits from the depths of the Fortune Golden Palace. Another reason was that the Nangong family had many trump cards. This super force had raised war weapons which only had killing in mind. They couldn't feel fatigued and had no emotions. For a long time, no one had ever seen any of these war weapons damaged. In the history of the spiritual state, these war weapons turned everywhere they went into a wasteland but remained intact themselves. Engulfed by thick smoke, red and black hued sword energies hacked down, and people could hear the shrill screams inside the smoke. Novel-full the mountains on both sides shattered, turning into many giant rocks before collapsing into the abyss. If not for the extremely powerful defense system of Xuanhuan City, this city would have been destroyed by the residual energy waves of the attacks. A spiritual light rose outside Xuanhuan City. Obviously, the city had activated its defense system. When some sword energies crashed onto the spiritual light, they exploded and scattered like fireworks. The guards standing on the city wall split and gave way to a powerful-looking, middle-aged man who had gray hair. He emitted a mountain-like presence which could shock people when they looked at him. Mr. Castellan. The guards in the area quickly greeted him. The middle-aged man gave them a slight nod and then looked up at the sky with an unreadable expression. The last time that Nangong family sent out sword slaves was about 200 years ago, right? Standing beside him was a middle-aged cultivator wearing a long robe. He looked scholarly, elegant, and otherworldly. Yeah, it has been a long time. Castellan Zong, how many attacks do you think this young man can block? The long-robed, middle-aged cultivator asked. The Castellan didn't reply, looking thoughtful. 5? The long-robed, middle-aged man gave a range. About 10, Castellan Zong said, from the looks of it. He will lose soon. What a pity. Why did this talented young man mess with YJR Nangong family? The moment he said it, they heard loud noises under the wall. What's happening? Is this kid crazy? I think he's waiting to be killed. In the sky, the young man stepping on the flying sword seemed to have been forced into a corner by the strikes of the sword slaves. Despite the great speed of his flying sword, the sword slaves had built a dense and horrifying net of sword energies from which no one could escape. However, they saw the young man standing on the flying sword do something that they could never have imagined. Looking at the horrifying sword attacks from both sides, Mr. Fang lit up a cigarette cheerfully. The cigarette end lit up and looked bright against the gloomy sky. Then, two pitch-black sword energies shot past him. Crack. Novel full. Boom. The sword energies hacked down huge pieces from the mountains on both sides. The whole area fell silent. Then, a thin layer of spirit light covered with strange treasure patterns and white flares surrounded Fang Qi. Who intact, Mr. Fang blew out some smoke from his mouth. His left hand slightly opened, and the spirit light quickly shrunk and transformed into an exquisite palm-sized hollow metal ball covered by strange cloud patterns. It emitted radiant light and looked as dazzling as a mini-sun in his hand. This is... He blocked the attacks. All the cultivators watching the battle gasped and forgot to close their mouths. What is that spiritual treasure? He used it to block the attacks of two sword slaves and remained intact. Ultimate treasure. It must be an ultimate treasure on the same level as those from the Fortune Golden Palace. Golden Sun Wheel. It was one of the ultimate spiritual treasures of the Kunlun faction from the movie Shu Mountain. In the movie, even the Yuquan blood demon couldn't break it before it absorbed the energy from the blood cave. At this moment, the sword slaves launched several strikes, and these strikes were as dense as mountains and contained greater force. Ding dang. With two huge noises, the two swords hacked onto the spiritual treasure, and the people saw that the young man in the sky didn't move a muscle and remained intact. Not even a strand of his hair was hurt. Did he get it from the Fortune Golden Palace? Many cultivators were green with envy, and they had the urge to rush over and grab it from Mr. Fang. How come there is such an awesome treasure in the world? Meanwhile, Castellan Zong exchanged a surprised look with the cultivator wearing the long robe. I'm surprised that he has such a trump card. No wonder he dares to challenge the Nangong family. The long-robed cultivator shook his head while he watched the sword slaves hack onto the golden sun well tirelessly. This spiritual treasure is indeed powerful, but he can win by defending. When his spiritual essence runs out, he will die for sure. The Castellan nodded. The sword slaves only attack and never defend. He might be able to kill one sword slave with a sudden suicidal attack, but who would trade their life with a sword slave? This young man will die soon. While they talked, many cultivators eagerly moved closer toward the edge of the array as if they were waiting for the spiritual treasure to drop. However, before the Castellan finished his words, a bronze crescent-shaped spiritual treasure appeared in Fang Qi's hand. While holding the burning golden sun wheel with one hand, Fang Qi formed a sword spell with the other hand and controlled the golden moon wheel to rotate around him like a new moon. He remained still when the two sword slaves attacked again. With two crisp noises, two figures separated while the golden moon wheel drew an elegant arc like a new moon. Dumbfounded, all the people saw that these sword slaves had been somehow cut into two halves. The cultivators who had been waiting to pick up the spiritual treasures backed off subconsciously. However, the battle wasn't over. Under everyone's gaze, a vast amount of black smoke rushed out of the broken bodies, and the broken body parts came together, repairing themselves. I remember now. One cultivator on the ground yelled in shock. About 200 years ago, the sword slaves of the Nangong family entered the spirit-destroying array in Green Bull Valley. When they came out, all the cultivators in the valley had their heads chopped off, but the sword slaves remained intact. I thought the rumor was wrong, but now I know it's true. With the cigarette dangling between his lips, Mr. Fang watched in surprise while the sword slaves healed themselves. They're still alive? The Castellan's expression slightly changed. It seems that we have underestimated the depths of this ancient family that has received this great inheritance. Chapter 440, Are you all like this when playing games? The sword slaves died just like that. Everyone backed off when Fang Qi landed as if he was a plague. The cultivators, who had swarmed up and even wanted to grab Fang Qi's treasures after he was killed, now felt goosebumps all over their bodies. They had witnessed how horrifying the sword slaves were. Many people here couldn't block one attack from their swords since the sword techniques of the sword slaves were so advanced, let alone that they had no weaknesses and had the strange ability of not dying. For them, such humanoid war machines were nightmarish. They couldn't imagine what would happen if such a horrifying nightmare fell on their heads. They had no way of dealing with it, and it was impossible to resist. However, just a moment ago, these two terrifying sword slaves just kneeled before the young man and killed themselves at his order. This turn of events had gone beyond everyone's imagination. They felt like the man before them wasn't a human being but the god of swords. Perhaps only the god of swords could do this. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. The members from the Nangong family looked as if they had seen a ghost. The sword slaves of the Nangong family had been unrivaled, but they just kneeled before a young man from nowhere and killed themselves today. The fear-inducing image of the sword slaves collapsed in their hearts. It completely collapsed and shattered into dust. What technique did you just use? A member of the Nangong family asked in horror. It was Sword God. Mr. Fang looked around but couldn't find a garbage can. To prevent polluting the environment, he released a flame from his hand and burned the cigarette butt into ashes. Then, he added, it was Sword God cast at the Heavenly Sword Realm. Fang Qi had just been standing before the threshold of the Heavenly Sword Realm. After his potential was stimulated by the magical cigarette, he stepped over the threshold and reached the realm. When No Name reached the Heavenly Sword Realm, all swords submitted to him. When he reached the highest level of the realm, no one could move a sword before him. Since Fang Qi had found a way to reach this realm, his power was now unrivaled. Novel full. Combining this realm with the Sword God of Shu Mountain faction, the most powerful sword control technique, it wasn't surprising that he could control the two demonized swords. Heavenly Sword. Sword God? Today, almost all the cultivators in Yuanyang City remember these two fear-inducing names. Today, they witnessed a sword technique that they had never heard of before. They could force all the swords in the world into submission. Mr. Fang patted the member of the Nangong family on the shoulder. The latter had yelled and asked the sword slaves to kill Fang Qi. An intense smell of urine spread out while this young man collapsed. Mr. Fang was at a loss for words. Am I so scary? The stout Castellan Zong and the middle-aged man who was wearing a long robe walked over, and the Castellan cupped his hands at Fang Qi, saying, I'm surprised that your swordsmanship has reached such an unrivaled realm. Can you tell us who was your master? Master? Mr. Fang said, the man who taught me the heavenly sword is no name. As for the sword god technique, many people can use it. Zong Wu's face twitched when he heard that many people had learned it. Then where are these masters? The middle-aged man immediately asked, can I pay a visit to them? Mr. Fang said, this. Zong Wu looked disappointed. Could it be that the seniors don't want to see us? In my opinion, some people here are not qualified to meet these seniors. The middle-aged man wearing the long robe looked around, and the people who had ill intentions backed off subconsciously and moved away. You can see them, but it would be 2 crystals per hour, Mr. Fang said. Ugh, like that? Not only Castellan Zong Wu and the middle-aged man wearing the long robe, but all the people around them were stupefied. After a moment of silence, Zong Wu said, please take us to them then. He looked as if he would sleep with these seniors in the night if there were no rules forbidding that. Soon, dozens of people eagerly walked into the internet cafe with Mr. Fang. Inside the internet cafe, several hairy-faced men who looked like they hadn't fully evolved were watching something intently, each with a bowl of instant noodles in their hands. A big white deer sat before a computer near the entrance and yelled at the screen with a bottle of Coke between its hooves. A few words were written on the small blackboard. 2 crystals hour. Zong Wu pointed at the main item written on the small blackboard and asked, what is this Legend of the Sword and Fairy 3? Where are the seniors? He looked around and didn't see any senior. Li Xianer looked baffled, wondering how the boss came back with so many customers with him. She immediately walked up and asked, Misters, what do you want to buy? Our shop's main game is the Legend of the Sword and Fairy 3. It's MFCKING awesome. Li Waya had learned this expression, feeling like it would make him look more like an old driver. Zong Wu cupped his hands and said, I want to meet a senior who knows the technique named Sword God. Then, you must play the Legend of the Sword and Fairy 3. There isn't only Sword God but Demonic Flame Space Flashing Strike, Nation Destroying Silver Bullet Wave, Demon Lord Chong Lu, Immortal General Fei Peng. Excited that so many customers came into the shop, Li Wai began to explain the game in detail. The visitors exchanged a look of bafflement. Zong Wu froze for a moment and looked at the middle-aged man wearing the long robe, saying, Elder Yu, shall we? This middle-aged man was an elder of the Heavenly Academy responsible for the management of Taiwan. He nodded. Then, under Mr. Fang's instruction, they entered the game. Dozens of people stood behind them to watch. Some of them were the 2 men's guards while others were a small group of cultivators who had watched the battle but held no ill intentions. What is this? Elder Yu almost jumped from a seat, and his voice was full of horror. Is this the immortal realm? Zong Wu looked terrified. I saw an immortal. The immortals are fighting. Run. Quick. Scared, both of them dropped their virtual reality headsets. It was so scary. They were still frightened. Novel full. There are immortals in there. Elder Yu had cold sweat on his face. Fortunately, I ran fast. It was horrifying. He hacked down an immortal palace with 1 sword strike. I'm proud that I could flee from an immortal. I even saw a demon. Fortunately, he didn't discover me. Elder Yu said in horror. They turned around and saw a group of dumbfounded people. Mr. Fang was also dumbfounded. I already told you that it's a game. Are you all like this when you're playing games? Chapter 440. Are you all like this when playing games? The sword slaves died just like that. Everyone backed off when Fang Qi landed as if he was a plague. The cultivators, who had swarmed up and even wanted to grab Fang Qi's treasures after he was killed, now felt goosebumps all over their bodies. They had witnessed how horrifying the sword slaves were. Many people here couldn't block one attack from their swords since the sword techniques of the sword slaves were so advanced, let alone that they had no weaknesses and had the strange ability of not dying. For them, such humanoid war machines were nightmarish. They couldn't imagine what would happen if such a horrifying nightmare fell on their heads. They had no way of dealing with it, and it was impossible to resist. However, just a moment ago, these 2 terrifying sword slaves just kneeled before the young man and killed themselves at his order. This turn of events had gone beyond everyone's imagination. They felt like the man before them wasn't a human being but the god of swords. Perhaps only the god of swords could do this. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. The members from the Nangong family looked as if they had seen a ghost. The sword slaves of the Nangong family had been unrivaled, but they just kneeled before a young man from nowhere and killed themselves today. The fear-inducing image of the sword slaves collapsed in their hearts. It completely collapsed and shattered into dust. What technique did you just use? A member of the Nangong family asked in horror. It was Sword God. Mr. Fang looked around but couldn't find a garbage can. To prevent polluting the environment, he released a flame from his hand and burned the cigarette butt into ashes. Then, he added, it was Sword God cast at the Heavenly Sword Realm. Fang Qi had just been standing before the threshold of the Heavenly Sword Realm. After his potential was stimulated by the magical cigarette, he stepped over the threshold and reached the realm. When No Name reached the Heavenly Sword Realm, all swords submitted to him. When he reached the highest level of the realm, no one could move a sword before him. Since Fang Qi had found a way to reach this realm, his power was now unrivaled. Novel full. Combining this realm with the Sword God of Shu Mountain faction, the most powerful sword control technique, it wasn't surprising that he could control the two demonized swords. Heavenly Sword. Sword God? Today, almost all the cultivators in Yuanyang City remember these two fear-inducing names. Today, they witnessed a sword technique that they had never heard of before. They could force all the swords in the world into submission. Mr. Fang patted the member of the Nangong family on the shoulder. The latter had yelled and asked the sword slaves to kill Fang Qi. An intense smell of urine spread out while this young man collapsed. Mr. Fang was at a loss for words. Am I so scary? The stout Castellan Zong and the middle-aged man who was wearing a long robe walked over, and the Castellan cupped his hands at Fang Qi, saying, I'm surprised that your swordsmanship has reached such an unrivaled realm. Can you tell us who is your master? Master? Mr. Fang said, the man who taught me the heavenly sword is No Name. As for the Sword God technique, many people can use it. Zong Wu's face twitched when he heard that many people had learned it. Then where are these masters? The middle-aged man immediately asked, can I pay a visit to them? Mr. Fang said, this. Zong Wu looked disappointed. Could it be that the seniors don't want to see us? In my opinion, some people here are not qualified to meet these seniors. The middle-aged man wearing the long robe looked around, and the people who had ill intentions backed off subconsciously and moved away. You can see them, but it would be 2 crystals per hour, Mr. Fang said. Ugh, like that? Not only Castellan Zong Wu and the middle-aged man wearing the long robe, but all the people around them were stupefied. After a moment of silence, Zong Wu said, please take us to them then. He looked as if he would sleep with these seniors in the night if there were no rules forbidding that. Soon, dozens of people eagerly walked into the internet cafe with Mr. Fang. Inside the internet cafe, several hairy-faced men who looked like they hadn't fully evolved were watching something intently, each with a bowl of instant noodles in their hands. A big white deer sat before a computer near the entrance and yelled at the screen with a bottle of Coke between its hooves. A few words were written on the small blackboard. 2 crystals hour. Zong Wu pointed at the main item written on the small blackboard and asked, what is this Legend of the Sword and Fairy 3? Where are the seniors? He looked around and didn't see any senior. Li Xianer looked baffled, wondering how the boss came back with so many customers with him. She immediately walked up and asked, Misters, what do you want to buy? Our shop's main game is the Legend of the Sword and Fairy 3. It's MFCKING awesome. Li Waya had learned this expression, feeling like it would make him look more like an old driver. Zong Wu cupped his hands and said, I want to meet a senior who knows the technique named Sword God. Then, you must play the Legend of the Sword and Fairy 3. There isn't only Sword God but Demonic Flame Space Flashing Strike, Nation Destroying Silver Bullet Wave, Demon Lord Chong Lu, Immortal General Fei Peng. Excited that so many customers came into the shop, Li Wai began to explain the game in detail. The visitors exchanged a look of bafflement. Zong Wu froze for a moment and looked at the middle-aged man wearing the long robe, saying, Elder Yu, shall we? This middle-aged man was an elder of the Heavenly Academy responsible for the management of Taiwan Inn. He nodded. Then, under Mr. Fang's instruction, they entered the game. Dozens of people stood behind them to watch. Some of them were the 2 men's guards while others were a small group of cultivators who had watched the battle but held no ill intentions. What is this? Elder Yu almost jumped from a seat, and his voice was full of horror. Is this the Immortal Realm? Zong Wu looked terrified. I saw an immortal. The immortals are fighting. Run. Quick. Scared. Both of them dropped their virtual reality headsets. It was so scary. They were still frightened. Novel full. There are immortals in there. Elder you had cold sweat on his face. Fortunately, I ran fast. It was horrifying. He hacked down an immortal palace with one sword strike. I'm proud that I could flee from an immortal. I even saw a demon. Fortunately, he didn't discover me. Elder you said in horror. They turned around and saw a group of dumbfounded people. Mr. Fang was also dumbfounded. I already told you that it's a game. Are you all like this when you're playing games?